Okay, so we'll share the nutshell and yep. Miketz. The name of the parsha Miketz means at the end and is found in Genesis chapter 41. Joseph's imprisonment finally ends when Pharaoh dreams of 7 fat cows that are swallowed up by 7 lean cows and of 7 ears of grain swallowed by 7 lean ears. Joseph interprets the dreams to mean that 7 years of plenty will be followed by 7 years of hunger and advises Pharaoh to store grain during the plentiful years. Pharaoh appoints Joseph governor of Egypt. Joseph marries Asnat, daughter of Potiphar, and they have 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Famine spreads throughout the region, and food can be obtained only in Egypt. 10 of Joseph's brothers come to Egypt to purchase grain. The youngest, Benjamin, stays home, for Jacob fears that for his safety. Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they do not recognize him. He accuses them of being spies, insists that they bring Benjamin to prove that they are who they say they are, and imprisons Simon as a hostage. Later, they discover that the money they paid for their provisions had been mysteriously returned to them. Jacob agrees to send Benjamin only after Judah assumes personal and eternal responsibility for him. This time, Joseph receives them kindly, releases Simon, and invites them to an eventful dinner at his home. But then he plants a silver goblet, purportedly imbued with magic powers, in Benjamin's sack. When the brothers set out for home the next morning, they are pursued, searched, and arrested when the goblet is discovered. Joseph offers to set them free and retain only Benjamin as a slave, and that's where the parsha ends, when all the brothers are heading back to Jerusalem, to Pharaoh, to Egypt, and pretty much a disaster on their hands because they promised they have to bring Benjamin back to their father, and the father will be devastated. And now the brother is being accused of stealing, and the emperor wants to keep him in Egypt, which is an absolute disaster for them. And next week you see how they respond. So there are big picture ideas in this parsha, and the specifics. The big specifics, of course, lead into the big picture. But if you really want to think broadly about what this parsha is doing, so we have essentially, I would say there's 2 big stories. There's the story of how Joseph rises to power. In other words, it's Joseph's dream interpretation, interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. So that's one very big idea. And the other big idea, which the Torah never tells us explicitly of what it's doing and why it's doing it, the other big idea is, what is Joseph trying to do to his brothers? Why is he harassing them? Why is he accusing them of being miraglim, of being spies? Why does he drive them crazy? Why does he drive his father crazy? Why does he schlep Benjamin to Egypt, even though he knows that it's going to cause tremendous pain to his father? Why does he accuse Benjamin of being? What is he trying to do? Now, we know what he's trying to do because of the next parsha. Eventually, he reveals his identity, but we don't understand what is he trying to achieve? Why couldn't he reveal his identity immediately? So the simple answer is he's trying to harass them because he's trying to punish them for what they did to him. But that answer does not stand up to any scrutiny, because if you see later how he treats them well and how he refuses even to acknowledge that they did anything wrong to him. He says it wasn't you, it was God, etc. So this is not a person who's taking revenge. And you see that again at the end of the book of Genesis, where after their father passes away, the brothers themselves do not believe that Joseph forgave them. They assume he was just waiting for the father to die, and now he's going to take revenge. And Joseph, again, the same story again and again, refuses to acknowledge even that they did anything wrong. Maybe they did, but it's not his business. He was saying it came from Hashem, it came from God, and Hashem sent me here for the michya, for bringing life, for bringing sustenance for the family and for the entirety of Egypt. So he's not taking revenge. So what is he doing? Okay, so that's something to think about. When you think about the story of the tribes, when you think about the story of the interpretation of the dreams, the big question, number one question that jumps out at you is, how come nobody else could think of this interpretation? Right? Vicky knows we talk about this every year. The dreams seem very simple and straightforward. It's like any person in the first year of dream interpretation should be able to figure out what's happening here. You have fat cows, you have skinny cows, you have healthy grain, bad grain. The bad grain swallows the good grain. It's all happening at the Nile, which is the source of Egypt's sustenance. What is the big deal? And the Torah makes the point that nobody else, Pharaoh called all his Khartoumim, all his wise people, all his dream interpreters. Nobody could tell him the interpretation. Rashi says they told him interpretations, but he felt that it didn't resonate with him. Nobody can figure this out, to the extent that when Joseph comes with his interpretation, wow, everybody says this. Pharaoh is in awe, and Pharaoh tells his servants, his ministers, nobody else can do this. Nobody else has this wisdom. So that's the big question. How come everybody else drops the ball? How come everybody fails where Joseph succeeds? So there are various interpretations. They all come from different points. We have to figure out the barriers, both the practical barriers and the psychological barriers and the spiritual barriers that would not allow someone from within Egyptian culture to understand what Joseph is saying. And which one is right? I don't know. Maybe they're all right? Because there could be multiple barriers. There could be practical barriers. There could be philosophical barriers. There's so many barriers to get to see the reality, because remember, they're sitting in Egyptian culture and their view is tainted by their perspective. So they're not open to see beyond their own perspective, their own culture, right? Which, by the way, we're going to return to this in a second, but I just want to say that from the Hasidic perspective, the second half of the book of Genesis is full of dreams. In the first half of the book of Genesis is very little dreams. There's one dream when Jacob is leaving Israel. Okay, the only dream that we have in the first, and there's other dreams for Avimelech, but not for the patriarchs. Patriarchs is one dream the patriarchs have. Jacob on the way out of Israel, related to going into exile. Okay, and then when you come to the second half of the book of Exodus, oh my God, everything is dreams. Joseph is dreaming, Pharaoh's ministers are dreaming, and Pharaoh is dreaming. 3 sets of dreams. And those 3 sets of dreams, what they lead to, ultimately, they lead to the exile, they lead to the Jewish people coming down to Egypt. So the Kabbalah says, so dreams are very much related to exile, because exile is like a dream. In other words, our perception of reality in exile is tainted and is unnatural, right? So naturally, we have certain perspective of the truth of the presence of God, of the nature of reality. This is all wisdom. These are all things that we have awareness of. But when a person is in the dream state, their logic is not what dictates their perception of reality, right? There is the imagination which takes over. And that's the state of exile, where the truth, the chachma, the wisdom, the enlightenment is concealed, and our perception of reality is based on things that are not real. And that is why the exile is brought about through dreams, because exile is a dreamlike state. That's just interesting. Also, there's certain advantages in a dreamlike state, which we'll get to in a second, but that just ties me in to say Egypt is like in a dream. In other words, you have the perceptions of reality which taint what you could see. So just like in a dream, what you're not going to, in a dream, things that are not normal become normal, and vice versa, because it just taints the way you see everything. And the same thing is going to be with the Egyptian culture. The culture does not allow them to see this straightforward, simple interpretation that's literally lying right in front of them. Now, once you go a little deeper, you say it's not so simple. It's actually very radical. And in some ways, it's actually the antithesis of what Egyptian culture stands for. So that's why they can't accept it. It will undermine their entire way of life. So people don't accept things that will make them so uncomfortable. They can't accept that as a possibility. So we can talk about that. Going back to the dreamlike state, which is exile, just to finish that point, because we're opening up too many points here. So Chassidus explains, Kabbalah explains that the dream, exile is like a dream. It's even in the Tehillim. When we say on Shabbat, we say, before the grace after meals, we say, Shir Ma'alot, Song of Ascents, V'shuv Hashem et Shivat Zion Einu Kecholmim. When God returns the captives or the returnees of Zion, meaning when we return back to Israel after the exile, Hayinu Kecholmim, we were like dreamers. So what does that mean? It could mean all kinds of different things. One interpretation is when we come back, we look back at the exile and we see the exile as a state of a dream. Right? The simple interpretation could be we were always dreaming. It's like a dream. When the redemption comes, it's like a dream. We can't believe this is reality. Right? Maybe that's the simple interpretation. It's like a dream. It's too good to be true. It's like a dream. But the Kabbalistic interpretation is when we return, then we look back and we say, Hayinu kecholmim, we were like in the future tense. Now we will be like. We were like in past tense. I'm sorry. Hayinu, we were like dreamers. When were we like dreamers? So we came back? No, when we were in the exile. Okay, so what's the dream state? What's the state of what's the state of the dream? So the first thing is he doesn't have a proper perception of reality. Okay, so that's the negative. So in the sense of spiritual redemption, spiritual enlightenment is reality is holiness, reality is God, and the concealment is not the true reality. So that's a state of spiritual redemption. And spiritual exile is you don't sense the presence of God. You don't sense that God is the true reality. You feel like this world and nature is real and God is absent. Okay? So in that sense, it's like a dream. You don't have the true reality. You don't see the truth of God. Emet Havaya, Emet Hashem Le'olam, truth of God in the world. You don't see it. But so that's the negative side, as you mentioned. But then comes the Hasidic interpretation. A Hasidic interpretation says the dream also has a positive. What is it? What's the positive of a dream? So in the dream, you can have two opposites simultaneously, right? Logic says you got to stick to the rules. Everything has rules, and it have to be consistent. Things cannot be consistent. And the dream sort of breaks all this consistent. You don't have to be consistent. You have two extremes, two opposites. There's a whole discussion in the Gemara whether or not it's actually a funny discussion whether or not. How crazy could dreams get? Could you think of something that's completely impossible? And one is, for example, could you see an elephant going through the needle of the eye of a needle? So the needle makes a little teeny hole. Could you see an elephant going through the needle eye? And there's two interpretations. One place is that there's two sources. One place says yes, one place says no. So it's a contradiction. And the answer is, if you think about it during your day, you'll see it at night. You'll see it in the dream. So in other words, even something like as crazy as that is possible to see in the dream. The point here is that in reality, there's logic, and logic has certain rules, and you don't have contradictions, and you cannot have opposites coexisting at the same time. But in a dream state, you could. Says the Hasidic interpretation. So what's spiritual exile? You could love God and love materialism at the same time. Is that logical? No. They're opposites. How could I love God? Right now I say, I love the Lord your God. 2 minutes later, I love a piece of pizza. So it's just opposites, right? God is spiritual. If you love God, it's because you understand that the true reality is transcendent and it's spiritual. It's not the tangible. It's not the physical. And a minute later, I love my ice cream, and I want 2 scoops, and I want one to be vanilla, one to be strawberry. Okay, so what's happening? So you could say, well, I'm a fraud. My love to God is not real. But we say, no. You're in exile. You're in a dream state. You're in a state of dream. Your spiritual exile is a state of a dream. In dreams, opposites can coexist. It's not logical. Okay, we're not in a logical state. We're in a state of exile. If you went to the temple, when the temple stood, and you went to the temple on a pilgrimage holiday, and you experienced the presence of God, of course you're not going to want chocolate ice cream. Or you're not going to love chocolate ice cream. You'll want it, but you're not going to love it. You want it because you have to eat it for the mitzvah, but for the holiday. But you're not going to love it. You love the Lord your God because you see the true reality. But if you're in a state of spiritual exile, physical or spiritual exile, things can coexist. You can love God and you can love materialism at the same time. They both coexist. They say it's not logical. Very good. Who said we have to be logical? We're not in a state of logic. So that's the negative side. Says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, but with a positive, the Alter Rebbe says, coming from the Alter Rebbe's celebration on Shabbos 19, Friday, Shabbos, the 19th of Kislev, 20th of Kislev, says the Alter Rebbe, you are in a state of exile, you could use it for the positive, which means even if you're in a state of you're in a state that you love materialism, don't be afraid to also cultivate a love for God. Say, what do you mean? That's not me. That's not who I am. I'm not on that level. Doesn't matter. Two things can coexist. In other words, just like there's a negative side to exile, there's also a positive side to exile that you can jump very quickly to cultivating holiness and spirituality, and it can coexist even if I'm not perfect. In a state of reality, in a state of redemption, it wouldn't make sense. You can't do both. You have to make your choice. But in a state of a dream where everything is confused, you could jump very quickly from the negative to the positive. So everything in the negative side also has a positive side. A dream is a negative state, but a dream also has a positive side. And if we are in exile until we're out of exile, while we are in exile, we should cultivate the positive. So that's a little bit about dreams, a little bit about how we look at reality is going to paint everything we understand. And now we go back to the dreams. What were some of the barriers that would not allow the interpreters of Pharaoh to come up with the simple truth, with the simple interpretation that the dream of Pharaoh is really straightforward: 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty. And there's another whole story, which is the solution. Jacob is proposing a solution, Joseph proposes the solution, which is also strange because nobody ever asked him to give the solution. We asked him to give a dream interpretation, and now he comes forward and he says, I also have a solution of what you should do. Collect grain in the years of famine for the years of plenty. Now that's actually pretty good advice. But if you are a slave and you're coming out of prison, nobody asked you for the advice, you don't have a mandate to say that advice. So why are you saying it? And why is he accepting it from him? And why does Pharaoh say, nobody else can do this, only you? Why? What are his credentials? You're a dream interpreter, and that's why you can become an administrator, and you can be the person who knows how to collect grain, right? It's a different set of skills. One's a poet, one's a spiritual person who could see the meaning of dreams, and the other is an administrator. It's not the same skill. You see it in Israel all the time, the past 50 years, where you had people who were great in the army, and they were generals, and they said, oh, so because you're a good general, you're going to be a good minister, and you're going to be a good member of parliament, and you're going to be a good prime minister. And of course, it's not true, because in the army, if you're a general, everybody has to bow to you, and no one's going to question you. And if you are in politics and you're a member of parliament and you're used to for your entire career, everybody telling you, yes, general, and saluting you, and then you come into the parliament and everyone tells you, jump in the lake, you have no skills to operate in a democracy. And it's been a failure. And the best generals had the worst relationships with other parties. It's a disaster, right? In other words, just because you're good at one thing, it doesn't mean you're good at something else. So very nice. Joseph is an amazing dream interpreter. Now we're going to say, so you're going to be the one that has to gather all the grain. What does one have to do with the other? It's actually a miracle that Joseph was able to do both, right? If you ask me, I would say the dream interpreter is going to be a bad administrator, right? But Pharaoh says, oh, there's no one like you that can do it. No one's as wise. You don't have to be wise to be administrator. Maybe you do a different type of wisdom. It's not the same type of wisdom. So these are some of the questions that we bring up every year, and hopefully we can organize it and present it with a new light, new energy. But we have to start from the basics, and we have to go to the basic interpretations, and then we can see what happens. In the meantime, questions, comments, disagreements, jokes, anything else, please share. Otherwise, we jump right in. Okay, so the first thing we'll say is what I say every year. And the reason why it's beautiful is because it also explains last week's Parsha. Last week's Parsha, the Torah tells us in great detail about the dreams of Pharaoh's ministers and how Joseph interprets those dreams. Now, we understand that it's important for the plot, right? It's important to the plot because the only way Joseph is called upon to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. How do you get Joseph? If you had to write the story, how do you get Joseph from being a slave in prison to ascending immediately, right? Not gradually, right? How do you get him from the pit to the throne? Okay, so you have to do something dramatic. So he has to become the dream interpreter. So he has to have a history of dream interpretation. So he has to interpret the dreams of he has to interpret the dreams of the ministers of Pharaoh. Okay, but if you look at that story, those stories are actually written in great detail. I think with some skill, you could shrink down those stories and say he interpreted their dreams. One he said is going to be a God will Pharaoh will restore you to your previous posts, and the second one says Pharaoh will kill you. Right? You can really shrink it down. The Torah gives us a great length, exactly what happened there. So that's why it's so beautiful, because the thesis is Joseph could not interpret Pharaoh's dreams until he learns how to interpret the minister's dreams. And the minister's dreams teach him all the skills he needs, and he applies them to Pharaoh's dream. And there's two major points which I'm going to say, which I say at least one of them every year, but you have to say it again, and then we can start branching out. I want to say one more thing about going back. I'm sorry if I'm jumping all too much. You got to slow me down. Let's go back to Joseph's dream, when Joseph dreamt. So when Joseph dreamt, what does he say? He says, the first dream, we're all binding bundles in the field, him and his brothers, right? This is 2 weeks ago. We're all binding bundles in the field, and the Hebrew says, "V'hine," and behold, kama lumati v'gam nitzavam. My bundle stands up and stands firm. So it's a lot of words. You could have just said, your bundles surround my bundle and bow to my bundle. That's the end of the verse. Your bundle surrounded my bundle, and they bow, and bows to my bundle. What does it mean? And my bundle stands up and stands firm. So some people interpret, I forget already who, someone says this is a very important part of the story. This alludes to Joseph's attaining power immediately, not gradually. Right? Kama, to stand up firm, means behold, it's happened automatic. He gets up, right? So this is automatic. In other words, it's abrupt, right? It's not gradual. If you look on the gradual stage, he's actually going further and further down, right? If somebody's climbing the corporate ladder and eventually becomes a CEO, okay, things like that happen. Not in Egypt. In Egypt, there's always classes, and if you're born a slave, you can't become free. There's no upward mobility. Okay, but even in free countries or relatively free societies, you understand there are stories of someone who started at the bottom and climbs the ladder. Joseph is not climbing the ladder. Joseph is actually going down the ladder, right? He's been going, his whole entire trajectory is going from bad to worse. But but his emergence, he arises, that is immediately and abruptly, which shows it's the hand of God. So that's v'hine kama lumati. It happens automatically. I stand up, behold, I rise up and rise up firm. It's not gradual, it's immediate. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. I was expecting you to interpret it like Joseph's attitude, his connection to higher power. That what led him to rise.
Yeah, there's no question that Joseph is connected to God, and that's why he says it. He keeps saying it. He says it both to Pharaoh, and he says it to the ministers. When he says, the first time when he introduces, when he says, "Tell me your dreams and I will," so he can interpret. He says, "Halel Elokim Pitronim." He says, interpretations come from Hashem, and interpretations come from Hashem. And he says, "Tell it to me, and maybe I'll be able to help." So he's mentioning God's name, and also to Pharaoh himself. When Pharaoh says, "I heard you're a great dream interpreter," if I'm Joseph, what do I say? Yes, I'm the number one expert dream interpreter. Right? You want to build up your credentials. They say the story that they called the chief rabbi. I forget, he was the chief rabbi of the Rabbinical Council of America and Canada. No, I forget. That's a different joke. Similar joke. But you know this joke. This joke is they call the rabbi to testify in court, and the judge says to the rabbi, "I heard you're one of the greatest rabbis in America." So the guy says, "No." He says, "I'm not one of the greatest rabbis in America. I'm the greatest rabbi in America." So he says, "Really? Don't you think that's a little bit arrogant?" So he says, "What am I going to do? I'm under oath." He's under oath. He has to say the truth. So if I'm Joseph and Pharaoh says, "Wow, you're the great dream interpreter," I say, "Yes, of course." What does Joseph say? Joseph says, "Elohim yanesh biladai." It's beside for me. I'm beside the point. God is the one who will answer the peace of Pharaoh. In other words, the peace. In other words, In other words, their interpretation comes from God. So he keeps attributing it to God. So you could read the story and you could say Joseph is able to give the interpretation because he's a spiritual man and God helps him. Okay, that we understand. The question is, why did everyone else miss the boat? So obviously there are certain obstacles that the people who are not connected to God are going to miss, and Joseph is connected to God, is able to see. Now you could say God did a miracle that they shouldn't figure it out. You could say that, but that we don't want. We only say that if you have no choice. There's a logical path to interpret the story. So before we get to the spiritual side, let's do the practical side. The practical side is basically there are two problems with Joseph's interpretation. In other words, if you would go to study a dream interpretation, there would be two problems. The first one is much more important than the second, but the second is also interesting. What are the two problems? Problem number one is never make the mistake of putting a timetable on your interpretation. Never do that, because what's going to happen? Chances are it's not going to happen exactly when you think it's going to happen, and you are going to be wrong. When the civil war started in Syria, what was it, 2014 or 2013, out of 2012, I don't even remember. I can't tell you how many experts in Israel got up and said the Assad regime is going to fall within 2 weeks or within 2 months. And why? Because they understood the guy is corrupt. The guy has no support of the people. The guy has no allies, and the guy has no army. Whatever, his army is also corrupt. So they knew what's going to happen. The problem was they said it's going to happen in 2 months. It didn't happen in 2 months. It happened in 12 years. So were they right? Of course they're right. In other words, strategically they were right. But don't try to put a timetable on your prediction, because chances are you're going to be proven wrong. Every day you turn on the television, they're going to tell you what the economy is going to do tomorrow. It looks like the economy is going to go up, the economy is going to go down. Okay. If you knew exactly the timing, you'd probably be a billionaire, right? And then you wouldn't, you wouldn't have to turn on the TV. You would be a billionaire. Why? Because it's very easy to figure the trend, but to put a timetable on it is very, very difficult. And the first thing I tell you in dream interpretation is never, ever give a timetable, because it's not going to happen. Now, what is Joseph doing here? Joseph is saying something that is so radical that no other dream interpreter would ever say. It takes a tremendous amount of courage. Joseph says 7 cows are 7 years. That's the second thing he says in the interpretation. You could look at the verse. The first thing, he gives an introduction. He says, God, the big idea, 7 cows are 7 years. Bad cows, good years, good cows, good years, bad cows, bad years. When he says that, no one else would say that. Nobody else would explain that an object that you see in your dream represents a unit of time, because you're putting a timetable on it, and that's the biggest mistake as a dream interpreter, because you're going to be proven wrong. Only a man who feels that has some revelation, inspiration from Hashem, and senses that this is Hashem telling him the truth, he's willing to put his name out there and put his reputation out there and say, there's a timetable. Not only there's a timetable, Joseph is saying the dream happened twice because it's starting right now. It's not starting in 2 years from now. We are in the 7 years, right? God is doing it immediately. So that's a tremendous act of courage. Nobody else would do it. So in short, the first issue is that Joseph is the one who's going to say that an object in a dream represents a unit of time. That's the big idea. That's the courage. Look at Rashi, and Rashi quotes the Medrash. The Medrash has many examples that when the verse says that the dream interpreters did not interpret it to Pharaoh, Ein poter otam li Pharaoh. Nobody's going to interpret it to Pharaoh. So the dream interpreters say what? The dream interpreters say, so Rashi says, quoting the Medrash, it's not that they didn't have interpretations. They interpreted, but not for Pharaoh, because Pharaoh did not accept what they were saying. So they did offer alternative interpretations. Okay, what were the alternative interpretations? So Rashi does us a favor. He quotes from the Medrash. You don't have to open the Medrash. You can look straight at Rashi. But there are other interpretations. Rashi says, they said, 7 good cows and 7 bad cows. Okay, fine. So you're going to have 7 daughters are going to be born, and 7 daughters are going to die. Either the same 7 or other 7. If you had multiple wives, I don't know. You're going to conquer 7 cities, and then you're going to lose 7 cities. Okay, very nice. Very safe bets. Why? Because if I say you're going to conquer 7 cities, you can't prove me wrong. It didn't happen yet. I didn't tell you when it's going to happen. It's going to happen on your 119th birthday, right? You can't prove me wrong. So everybody else, you look at the Medrash, no one else is attributing a unit of time. Joseph is. That's the courage. Now, let's look back. Where does Joseph get it? What happened in last week's Parsha? When he sees the interpretations of the dream, and he sees that what? He sees that they both tell him, both those dreams. The first dream is, he says, there's a vineyard, and the vineyard has 3 branches. And then the baker says, I have 3 baskets on my head. Joseph says, in 3 days at Pharaoh's birthday, you're going to be restored and you're going to be killed. Okay, what did he do in that dream? He interprets that the objects in the dream represents units of time. There it's days, here it's years, but it's the same big idea. And how did it happen there? So there it's already closer to understand, because everyone knew Pharaoh's birthday. It's a national holiday. If you don't believe me, open up the North Korean news and you'll find out when the leader's birthday is. The leader's birthday is the #1 holiday of the year. And everyone has to be happy at the leader's birthday. So the same thing was in Egypt. So everyone knows 3 days, and Pharaoh and he understood what happens at the birthday party is the king he looks at his cabinet and he sees who we have to reinstate, and et cetera, et cetera. So the point here is that that's already the step 1. That's the sort of the baby step, and from the baby step he gets to the big step. We can speak to Pharaoh and say objects are units of time. So that's the first practical thing. The second practical thing is that the theory is that in a dream, you're not going to see the interpretation. The dream is always a metaphor. Okay? So if the dream is a metaphor, then if the interpretation is obvious, then it's the wrong interpretation, because it has to be a metaphor for something else. Right? So if you tell me that there's 7 ears of healthy grain, and then the bad grain eats the good grain, the interpretation cannot be that there's going to be bad grain. Because what that means, that'd be a year of famine, which is bad grain. Because that means that it's not a dream with a metaphor. That means it's prophecy. And I'm not sure they believed in prophecy. Right? So in their mind, you would never see the interpretation in the dream. The dream always has to be the metaphor for something else. So now, what was the question? The question is, isn't it so obvious that we're talking about years of plenty and years of famine? The answer is, of course, it's so obvious. And because it's so obvious, we cannot interpret it as the obvious interpretation, because then that's prophecy. It's not a dream interpretation. Dream interpretation is metaphor. Okay, let's go back for a second. How did last week's parsha, how did the dreams help Joseph? They helped Joseph because in last week's parsha, not every dream was a metaphor. The first dream was a metaphor. The metaphor that, the second dream was a metaphor. The dream that Pharaoh's baker had 3 baskets on his head and the birds were coming and eating the baked goods in the basket was a metaphor. What was the metaphor? They weren't eating the baked goods in the basket. They were actually eating the flesh of the baker who was going to be hung and be killed, right? So the second interpretation is a metaphor. The second dream was a metaphor. The first dream, there's no metaphor in the first dream. First dream is there's a branch, there's a vine, three branches are coming out of the vine. He says, I take the grapes, I squeeze them in the cup of Pharaoh, and I place the cup on Pharaoh's hand. What's the metaphor? No metaphor. That's exactly what's going to happen. That's what Joseph says. That's exactly what's going to happen. So what does Joseph see? Joseph sees, unlike the dream interpreters, sometimes you have prophecy. Sometimes Hashem tells you what's going to happen. And it doesn't go through dreams, doesn't go through the metaphors. And that's why in this week's Parsha, he's able to tell you that what you saw is actually not a metaphor at all. That's the interpretation. Remember, the same thing with the fat cows. Fat cows are not a metaphor. Fat cows, when you have fat cows, it's because there's what to eat, right? That's a sign that there's produce, that there's plenty of food. When the cows are thin and emaciated, that's because we're in a state of famine. So that's not a metaphor. That's exactly what's going to happen. There is an element of metaphor in the number. right? The number, 7 cows is 7 years. So the number of cows is even that, I don't know if it's a metaphor, it's a simple concept that numbers represent units of time as opposed to objects. Okay, so that's the practical things. Now we want to look for things that are a bit more of a spiritual nature in a way that would not allow for the dream interpreters to say what Joseph says, and in a way that would not allow for anybody else to be able to become the administrator. And that's why only Joseph, with his quote unquote Jewish perspective, is able to have this, is able to suggest and implement this solution. So that's what's coming. So right now, just to summarize, we have two problems, the two obstacles for the dream interpreters. Number one is they would never choose to interpret an object as a unit of time because that's going to expose you because you're going to be wrong. If you ever need advice from me, never give anyone a time frame. Never say this is going to happen within a certain amount of time. It could happen before, it could happen after. Even if you're right that these underlying concept, the underlying features exist, but when it's going to implode, or when it's going to happen, or when it's going to build, when it's going to all congeal and come together, very, very difficult to give a precise guess. So they don't want to say that objects are units of time. Joseph is willing to say that, which means he believes in his interpretation, which means he has the courage to put his reputation out there, to put his reputation on the line. And the second point is Joseph is not giving a metaphor. Joseph is saying, Pharaoh, God is telling you what's going to happen. This is revelation, right? In the Egyptian culture, that's not what they see. They see metaphor. Metaphor means that the gods they don't speak directly, they don't communicate directly to you. So there's some means through which the more spiritual reality expresses itself in the physical world or expresses itself in your dream, but it's always going to be a metaphor. Metaphor means you don't see the real truth. You have to extrapolate it. There's no direct intervention from Hashem telling you what to do. Joseph says, this is not an interpretation. God told you what's happening. God didn't tell you. God didn't allude what's happening. He gave you clear instructions. And that is also a big leap that the other people cannot pick up on. Okay, that's a summary of till now. Comments, questions, please share. Otherwise, we continue down the journey. Okay, so now comes one more step, one more obstacle, which is a little bit more subtle. But the new obstacle that the Egyptians missed is a little bit more subtle, but it's an absolutely brilliant point in my opinion, and it's the opening up to many more spiritual dimensions. It opens up the story to a lot more of spiritual interpretations, and I'm going to try to put it out here. I said it in the past. At some point, this was like my favorite commentary of the Rebbe on the Parsha, on the Chumash. At some point, this was like massive. Okay, so the Rebbe asked the same question that we asked, which is, why can't anyone else figure it out? And also, the Rebbe goes in the same direction that they can't figure out that the cows are units of time. How come? Not because of what I said. What I said is a little bit too cynical, which is they don't want to risk their interpretation. They know they're just guessing, so they're not going to give a time frame. The Rebbe says no. The Rebbe says, look at the dream. Look at the dream. And this is the key aspect of the dream. This is the key point. Even though when you read it, it seems like it's just a detail that is not important, that could have been skipped. But it is the key point of the dream. So instead of me telling it to you, we'll show it to you inside, because then you don't have to trust me. You can actually see it for yourself. So we're going to do that right now. I'm going to share the screen, God willing, with God's help, with the help of the technology here. I think we have it. I think we shared. Says the parsha, this is the dream. Okay, let's read 3 verses. It's not so bad. At the end of 2 full years, Pharaoh had a dream. In his dream, there he was, standing by the Nile River, when 7 good-looking, robust cows emerged from the Nile River and started grazing in the marsh. Verse 3 is the key. Then 7 other cows, ugly and scrawny, emerged after them from the Nile River. This is the key, ladies and gentlemen. And they stood next to the good-looking cows on the bank of the Nile. In verse 4, it says, The ugly, scrawny cows ate up the 7 good-looking, robust cows. Pharaoh then woke up. I ask you a question. What would happen if it would be missing the part that I highlighted? What happens if it wouldn't say, and they stood next to the good-looking cows in the bank of the river? So it's not just that, it's that entire point. Would you not understand what happened? Imagine the verse read, then 7 other cows, ugly and scrawny, emerged after them from the Nile River. The ugly, scrawny cows ate up the 7 good-looking, robust cows. Pharaoh then woke up. Beautiful. What is this business that it says, and they stood next to the good-looking cows on the bank of the Nile River? So this throws a wrench into everything here. What does it do? What it does is as follows. You cannot say the 7 years, the 7 cows are 7 years. Why? And then the 7 fat cows are 7 good years, and the 7 bad cows, and the 7 bad cows are 7 negative years. You cannot say that. Why not? Because if you're going to say that, cow years do not happen simultaneously. The 7 bad years follow the 7 good years, but they're not at the same time. And here in his dream, he sees the fat cows and the skinny cows grazing together simultaneously. I don't know if it was for 1 minute, for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, or for an hour. Doesn't matter, but that's an important part of the dream. So now Pharaoh's people say, you cannot say 7 fat cows are good, and 7 bad cows are 7 fat cows are 7 good years, and 7 bad cows are 7 bad years, because then the years must follow each other. They cannot be simultaneous. That's the obstacle. So they have to now run to all different directions. 7 kids, you will have 7 kids. 7 daughters, you will have 7 daughters you will bury. Okay, that could happen simultaneous. It's not the same kid can't be born and die at the same time, but maybe Pharaoh has 14 kids. Maybe he already has 7, and another 7 will be born, and simultaneously others die. In warfare, for sure, it can happen. You conquer 7 countries in the north, simultaneously you lose 7 countries in the south. That can happen simultaneously. So according to the Rebbe, this was the main point. This is what the obstacle. They could not figure out, what does it mean standing next to? And here comes the big idea. What does Joseph say? Joseph says in the dream, ladies and gentlemen, this is radical. I mean, I say it every year, so it's not radical. I mean, I heard it before, but it's still radical, just like the day it was first spoken. With Pharaoh, Joseph's big idea is not the diagnose. Joseph is not telling Pharaoh what's going to happen. He's not telling Pharaoh what God told him is going to happen. He's doing that too, but that's not the point. What Joseph is telling Pharaoh is that God is giving you the cure. God is giving you the solution, not the problem. In other words, make sure that the 7 fat years and the 7 skinny years coexist, that they exist simultaneously. How would that happen? Easy. If in the years of famine you're collecting in the years of plenty, you're collecting for the years of famine, and the years of famine you're eating off the years of plenty. So in the second half, it's obviously clear. You're in the years of famine, but you're surviving off the years of plenty. So you still have the years of plenty. You still have the fat cows while you have the skinny cows. And also, when you're living in the state of plenty, in your mind, you're very aware of the years of famine. And right now, you're doing actions to prepare for the years of famine right now. So now you're collecting because you understand this scarcity coming, even though you're in the state of plenty. And when there's scarcity, when there's a famine, you're benefiting off the plentiful grain. So now you're benefiting off the fat years. So what is Joseph? Now we understand the other question that we had initially, which was, who asked Pharaoh to give Pharaoh advice? Who asked Joseph to give Pharaoh advice? We asked you to interpret the dreams. We did not ask you to make policy or to offer suggestions. What's the answer? Why does he offer a suggestion? Why does he tell Pharaoh, now set out and get people and collect all the grain in the years of plenty, so you have it for the years of famine? Why does he say that? Why does he? Not because he's going out of his mandate and suggesting advice in addition to the dream interpretation. No, he's telling Pharaoh what the dream is telling him. The dream is telling you, make sure you have fat cows and skinny cows grazing together. That's what the dream is telling you. So the dream is not telling you the problem, the dream is telling you the solution. Now that is impossible for anyone in Egypt to say, ever. Why not? There's all kinds of reasons why not. There's different interpretations. I think the most beautiful interpretation is because in the Egyptian culture, in general, in cultures of pagan cultures, if the gods want something, they're stronger than you. And if they want to destroy you, they'll destroy you. It is impossible that God makes a decree, but we can sort of, in a way, quote unquote, outsmart God, right? That we could solve the problem that nature brings about, right? That is an empowering message. That's a message of freedom. That's a message of the superiority of the human being. Whereas, suppose in a pagan society, it's all about the gods. You better please the gods because what you do is insignificant. What matters is what they want. So the concept that there is a problem and nature itself suffers. Remember, in Egypt, there's never famine because the waters from the Nile, there's no rain in Egypt, but the rain happens in Central Africa, and the waters of the Nile are consistent. And there's no famine. Maybe in 100 years, maybe in 200 years, but there's no famine in Egypt. Assuming that worst case scenario that there's going to be a famine, it's because the gods want a famine. If the gods want a famine, nothing we can do. They believe in determinism. Nothing we can do could solve that problem. Joseph is saying nature has a problem. God, in other words, the gods, meaning gods of nature, they don't believe in God, they believe in nature. Nature creates a problem, but you, the person, God is telling you, not God, not Elohim, the God of nature, but Hashem. Actually, he does say Elohim. But God is telling you that you have the power to overcome the limitations of nature and solve the problem. That's something that nobody can do. And Pharaoh says, you have to be the one to do this because you believe in it. Nobody else believes in it, right? If you're appointed for a project that you don't believe in, you're going to fail at it. So imagine you take an Egyptian and you say, look, we have a problem. The gods want to destroy us. The gods make a famine, but you're going to collect enough grain and that will be able to sustain, and we'll be able to outsmart the gods. There's no way they're going to do it. They won't be successful. They don't believe in the enterprise. But Pharaoh senses that Joseph believes that God is empowering you. And that's Joseph's story itself. Joseph's story is that circumstances and God make you a slave and then a prisoner and a slave, but you could change. You could change things. Hashem will help, but you can do your part and change things and turn things around. And that's what Joseph sees, and that's what the dream interpreters could never see. One more step. So just layered, just to put the puzzle in. There's a beautiful piece of Kabbalah from the Ben Ish Chai. Ben Ish Chai was a rabbi in Baghdad about 100 years ago. And he was an unbelievable prolific writer. I think he wrote over 100 books at the time. And super Kabbalistic and super creative. And he says like this. He says that in Hebrew, the word for interpreting a dream, or really poter, to solve a dream, remember that we translate it as dream interpreters, but liftor, poter, is to solve. It's almost like solving a mathematical problem. Will be the same idea. To solve a math problem is poter. So to solve the problem, poter, first of all, it's the same letters as tofer. Tofer is, litfor is to sew, which means to connect. Okay? And then he throws one more verse. Those same letters, porat, same three letters, pei resh taf. Pei resh taf could be poter, could be poter, which is to interpret the dream, to solve the dream. It could be tofer, which is to sew, and it could be porat. And porat is beautiful. It's not a common word for beautiful, but it's a beautiful. The word means beautiful. It's actually a beautiful used in the context of Joseph himself, because if you look at the blessings of Jacob to his sons at the end of the parsha, at the end of the book of Genesis, and when he introduces his son Joseph, he says, Ben Porat Yosef. Joseph is a beautiful son. But he could have said there are other words for beautiful. He uses this uncommon term. So we have here, Joseph is a dream interpreter. Joseph is beautiful. He gave a beautiful interpretation. But Joseph also has a tofer, an element of sewing things together. What is he sewing together in this dream? So in this dream, what Joseph is doing in this dream is he's sewing together the problem and the solution. In other words, what do you see here? The skinny cows and the fat cows have to stay together. When you are you have to be able to see that the challenge and the solution to the challenge are part of one story. And therefore, when you have the difficult time, it's not separate from the blessing that preceded it, and you were supposed to prepare and supposed to protect yourself. In other words, the solution of Joseph to be a proper dream interpreter is to be able to see that the seemingly unrelated events are all part of a whole story. And if you look at Joseph's own story, you see it too. How could Joseph be optimistic? He had his dreams of being the leader, of everyone bowing to him. And nothing, it doesn't seem like it's happening. It seems like it's getting worse and worse. But after it gets worse and worse, it becomes better. Now you can look at it and say that I had how many year gap? I had a 23-year gap between my dream of becoming a leader. And there's 23 years that I'm sorry, 13 years of going down. And after that, it turned around and I started emerging to power, and I emerged to power. But that's wrong. Had he not had the difficult times, he would not have emerged to power. Had he not been in the prison, he would not become the dream interpreter for Pharaoh. So the skill of life is to be able to see how the challenging times and the times of success are all part of one story. And then the entire life is beautiful. That's Porat. So if you could interpret the dream, if you could see that all parts of life is all part of a whole story, and everything that happens to me and everything that I do is part of our overarching story, which is to fulfill my mission, fulfill my purpose, whatever that purpose may be, then every part of my life is beautiful. It's not the setback and then overcoming. No, what seemed to be the setback is what allows me to grow and overcome. So that idea of poter, to interpret the dreams, is really to tie and thread every part of my life together. So that's the story in short. A lot more to say. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. Really put all the pieces of puzzle together.
We have to sew it all together.
Yeah, but I had a question about your earlier comment about the dream state. So in exile, that we're kind of separating the love to spiritual and love to material. But can we in exile combine the two, like sew it all together?
We in a way we could, but in a way we have a distorted sense of reality. Unless you have spiritual redemption, that's a different story, right? You could be in exile, but you have spiritual redemption. The Zohar says that before souls like Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar, the souls of Rashbi, the temple was not destroyed. That's what the Zohar says, which is fascinating. Why? Because look at Rashbi's biography. Rashbi himself, Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, was persecuted by the Romans. He had to run away and hide in a cave for 12 years, and then the 13th year, because the Romans wanted to kill him. So if anyone felt the persecution of the Romans, it was Rashbi, right? But nevertheless, the Zohar says, Rashbi says, that for him, the temple was never destroyed. Why? Because he reached a state of spiritual redemption. But if I'm in spiritual exile, which is the more common state to reach redemption, spiritual redemption, a state of exile is very difficult. It could be done. That's why we have Hasidism. That's why we have the inner part of Torah to get to the deeper truth. But if you are in a state where you are in spiritual exile, means your definition of reality is distorted. Meaning, what is reality? Godliness is reality. What's meaningful? God is meaningful. I won the lottery. That's not meaningful. That's not going to cause me joy. What makes me happy? What makes me sad? Right? So if I'm in a state of spiritual exile, what makes me happy is if I have an increase in materialism or in physical things. And what makes me sad is if I've lost $1, then I'm sad. If I had an opportunity to do a mitzvah, okay, that doesn't make me happy. And if I lost an opportunity to do something good, that doesn't make me sad, because my value system, what I value, what is real to me in the state of spiritual exile is materialism. And I'm missing the real truth. The real truth is it doesn't matter. What matters is connection to God, because reality is godliness. But that is a state of spiritual enlightenment, a spiritual redemption. Now we're saying is even someone who's in a state of physical exile, okay, so my understanding of reality is distorted. So I really care about materialism. So what does that mean? It means I have no chance of connecting to spiritual life. Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, no, you're in a dream. Dreams, things happen. It's not consistent. So big deal. So last week, 2 minutes ago, I wanted pizza. Right now, you could love Hashem, but it's inconsistent with my overall perspective and reality. It doesn't matter. So it's not logical. Big deal. It's dreamlike state. But in a dreamlike state, you could still tap in to the truth, and the truth and the truth and the non-truth can coexist in a dreamlike state. When you wake up, you got to make a choice, right? Because there's clarity, but we're in a state where there's no clarity. So the downside is that we're not consistent. The upside is that we can easily tap into the to the holiness, to the spirit, you could have moments of spiritual redemption even amidst the spiritual exile.
And then we can actually feel the spiritual enlightenment in the physical.
Yeah, but then we're liberating the physical. Yeah, so we're not trying to run away. You are trying to sow, of course. We're sowing the physical and the spiritual, no question about it. That's a lot about, yeah, we're sowing the physical and the spiritual. We talked about it last week, where we're gathering all the grain, all the stalks of grain into one bundle. That's the setting of Joseph's dream. So we're uniting the physical and making it into one cohesive story. So we're also same theme as sewing things together. So anytime you bring from multiplicity to unity, you're bringing holiness. But the point is, we want to incorporate the materialism, but not the materialistic perspective, right? The materialistic perspective is a lie. The big lie. The big lie is that materialism is disconnected from Hashem. Materialism is disconnected from holiness. That's the big lie. The big lie is the state of exile. Now, the actual physical phenomenon is not the lie. The lie is the perspective, right? The perspective that it's independent and has its own meaning and has its own existence. That's the lie. And the more you can expand the perspective of the truth, you say Shema, you meditate, you love the Lord, then you can expand it a little bit more. You're more in the level of spiritual redemption, and you want moments of spiritual redemption, and sometimes it's a struggle. And on Shabbat and Yom Kippur, it's not a struggle, right? So we're a state of exile. We are being thrown around in this mix of confusion with enlightenment at the same time. So there are downsides to that, but there are upsides. That's the big idea. Okay, this has been a tremendous amount of fun. So thank you all for joining. Hope to see you next week in good health.
Bye-bye. Beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you, doctor. Thank you. Thank you.